July 25, 1944, 0950 hours. South of the ruined Norman town of St. Lo, in a command post dug beneath the roots of an apple orchard, Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein heard the earth begin to shake. It did not begin with gunfire. It began with sound from the sky, a deep mechanical roaring that grew and grew until it seemed to press the air itself downward. Then the bombs fell, and the ground lurched, and the telephone lines went dead, and the runners who went forward did not come back. And when the American infantry crossed the line that morning, and the reports finally reached him, Bayerlein did something unusual for a professional soldier of his rank and experience. He described exactly what had happened to his division without evasion, without political explanation, without blaming the weather or Hitler's interference or the cowardice of subordinates. He sat before American military historians in August 1945 and told them the truth. He said his men were dead. He said the ground looked like a moonscape. He said the Allied air-directed artillery had at times been worse than the bombers. He said that over 70% of the soldiers in his forward positions had been killed, wounded, driven mad, or concussed beyond the ability to function. He said he had faced nothing like it in 4 years of war across 3 continents. This is the story of how American artillery broke the finest armored division Germany fielded in the West, and of the extraordinary admission that emerged from the wreckage. To understand why Bayerlein's words carry the weight they do, you must first understand what he was commanding and what kind of man he was. The Panzer Lehr Division had not been assembled the way ordinary German divisions were assembled. It was not built from conscript drafts or territorial levies or the survivors of shattered formations. It was constructed deliberately, in the winter of 1943 to 1944, from the instructors, demonstration soldiers, and veterans of Germany's own armoured training schools. Formation began on the 30th of December, 1943, on the direct order of Heinz Guderian, built around cadre from Germany's 2 panzer troop schools, and supplemented by combat veterans from across the front. Every man assigned to it had been selected for his record. Every vehicle was issued to Panzer Lehr before it went to any other unit. Its grenadiers had trained other men how to fight. Its tank crews had taught younger soldiers the basics of armoured warfare. The division was, in the most literal sense possible, the assembled expertise of the German armoured force. When it moved toward Normandy in June 1944, Panzer Lehr carried nearly 15,000 men, along with tanks, assault guns, and tank destroyers, totaling well over 200 armoured vehicles, and artillery assets that any other German division in the West would have envied. British intelligence officers who studied its order of battle before the invasion called it the most powerful armoured division Germany had deployed in the West. By every measurable standard of the Wehrmacht in the summer of 1944, that assessment was correct. Its commander matched the formation he led. Fritz Bayerlein had served in the North Africa campaigns from October 1941, rising through the ranks of the Deutsches Afrikakorps before becoming Chief of Staff to Erwin Rommel at the army level in December 1942. He had ridden in staff cars across the Western Desert while Rommel made the armoured thrusts that earned Germany its most glamorous victories of the entire war. He had survived the evacuation of Tunisia. He had been present at enough of the pivotal engagements of the war on 2 fronts that his professional judgment commanded respect across the officer corps. He was not given to dramatic language or self-serving exaggeration. When he spoke about the operational state of a unit, other officers took the information at face value. When he described a battle, they believed him. This matters because what he described about July 25, 1944, would have strained credulity if any lesser witness had offered it. What destroyed his division on that morning was not merely a weapon, it was a system. And that system had been built not in Germany's answer to it, not in the urgent war planning of any European power, but quietly, methodically, over a decade, in the Red Clay Hills of southwestern Oklahoma at the United States Army Field Artillery School at Fort Sill. The problem the school was trying to solve in the 1930s was one that armies had accepted as permanent for generations. Every artillery battery could direct its own fire. A battery could place observers forward, compute the angles, and adjust its rounds onto a target with reasonable efficiency. What no army had been able to do quickly was mass the fires of multiple batteries or battalions onto a single target on short notice. To do that, each battery had to receive the target location, compute its own firing data independently, receive orders through a chain of command, and fire at some coordinated moment. The process took hours. By the time it was complete, a mobile target had moved, or the tactical situation had changed, or the window of opportunity had closed. 2 officers at Fort Sill decided to attack this problem directly. Major Carlos Brewer, as director of the gunnery department in the late 1920s and early 30s, introduced battalion centralized fire direction techniques. In the spring of 1931, his department demonstrated massed battalion fire from a single computational node, and the result was decisive enough that the idea could not be ignored. Major Orlando Ward, who followed him, developed the concept into what became the formal Fire Direction Center. The idea was to create a single computational hub at battalion level. Every piece of relevant information would flow into that center: the observer's grid coordinates for the target, the atmospheric conditions, the temperature, the muzzle velocity variations of each gun, the precise location of every tube in the battalion. A team of specialists at the center would process all of that data together and translate it into simultaneous firing commands for every gun in range. Those commands would go out by radio and telephone wire. The guns would fire at the computed instant, and all their rounds would arrive within seconds of each other. The observer would watch the impact and call his correction. The center would compute the adjustment and send new data to every tube in time for the next volley. General Leslie McNair, who had served as assistant commandant of the Field Artillery School while Brewer and Ward were developing their ideas, and who later commanded the Army Ground Forces during the years of American military expansion, drove the Fire Direction Center into doctrine, into the unit tables of every artillery battalion being formed, and into the curriculum of every officer school in the country. By the time American divisions were training across the United States in 1942 and 1943, the Fire Direction Center was not a theoretical innovation or an experimental concept. It was the standard procedure. Every artillery officer was trained in it. Every battalion had the personnel and equipment to operate it. No other army in the world had built this capability above the battery level. Not Britain, not the Soviet Union, not France, and certainly not Germany. The tactical product this system created was called the time-on-target concentration. When a fire direction center received a time-on-target mission, it broadcast a countdown to every participating battalion. Each battalion computed its own time of flight, from its own position to the target, worked backward from the coordinated moment of arrival, and fired at the precise instant required for its shells to land simultaneously with every other shell in the mission. The effect on the receiving end was that the first round and the 100th round arrived within approximately 3 seconds of each other. There was no opening salvo to announce what was coming, no ranging shot that a veteran soldier could identify as the signal to move. The fires simply appeared, all of them at once, with no interval for reaction. Veterans of the Eastern Front who faced this technique for the first time in Normandy had no reference point for it. They had experienced heavy fire. They had not experienced the specific combination of mass and simultaneity that the time-on-target method produced. The communications system that made all of this possible was equally important and equally deliberate. American artillery battalions were equipped with frequency-modulated radio sets rather than the amplitude-modulated sets used by most European armies. Frequency-modulated radio was largely immune to the static interference generated by vehicle ignition systems, a persistent problem that plagued German radio communications during mobile operations and degraded the speed and reliability of German fire requests at critical moments. The forward observers, who called American missions, carried sets from the SCR 300 family of man-portable radios, operating in the 40 to 48 MHz range with a practical voice range of roughly 3 to 5 miles under typical field conditions. The same observer could, if necessary, talk directly to his battalion fire direction center, to an adjacent battalion center, or to a division or corps coordinator, depending on the tactical situation and the size of mission required. The individual guns the Americans brought to Normandy were capable weapons, but not especially remarkable by the standards of 1944. The divisional piece was the 105mm M2 A1 howitzer, a towed weapon that could fire a 33-pound high-explosive shell to 12,330 yards at a sustained rate of 3 rounds per minute per tube, with a trained crew capable of brief bursts of 10 rounds per minute. Every American infantry division in Normandy had 3 field artillery battalions of these weapons, each with 18 guns, plus a 4th battalion of heavier 155mm pieces. The 155mm M1 howitzer threw a 95-pound projectile, approximately 14,600 meters, the equivalent of roughly 16,000 yards, and was served by an 11-man crew. American armored divisions incorporated 54 self-propelled M7 Priest howitzers, which mounted the 105mm piece on an armored tracked chassis and could keep pace with tanks across any terrain. At corps and army level, the weapons grew heavier. The M12 155mm gun motor carriage had been developed from a First World War-era French gun tube, mounted on a tank chassis, and could reach targets at approximately 20,000 yards. 74 M12 carriages had been specifically overhauled between February and May of 1944 for the Normandy invasion, equipping multiple corps artillery battalions that would participate in Operation Cobra. The 155mm long tom gun reached targets at over 25,000 yards. The 8-inch M1 howitzer, prized by every artilleryman who fired it for its extreme accuracy, dropped 200-pound shells at 18,500 yards. These were serious weapons, but the weapons alone were not what Bayerlein was talking about when he made his confession. By the summer of 1944, the campaign in France had reached a condition that neither side had anticipated. The Allied landings on June 6 had succeeded in establishing a beachhead, but the breakout into open country that the planners had expected within weeks of the invasion had not materialized. The Norman bocage, the ancient system of earthen banks topped with dense vegetation that divided the countryside into hundreds of small enclosed fields, had converted the entire theatre into a series of natural fortifications. Every hedgerow was a ready-made defensive position. Every lane between them was a kill zone for any attacker. Tanks were channeled into choke points where individual German soldiers with handheld anti-tank weapons could knock them out one at a time. The elaborate calculations of air and artillery superiority that the Allied planners had used to justify the invasion timetable did not account for what the bocage did to offensive momentum. The German commanders defending Normandy were skilled professionals operating in terrain that favored their doctrine. Rommel had spent months before the invasion fortifying every approach, mining every beach, flooding coastal fields, and positioning his artillery to cover likely landing zones. Behind the beaches, he had stationed some of the finest divisions remaining in the German order of battle. The 1st SS Panzer Division, the 12th SS Panzer Division, the 2nd Panzer Division, Panzer Lehr, and numerous infantry divisions occupied the defensive belt behind the Norman front. The 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army together committed more than 380,000 men to contain the Allied bridgehead. Yet, from the first days after the landing, something was going wrong that the German situation reports struggled to name. Formations moving to reinforce the front were being struck by fire from guns they could not see. Ammunition convoys were ambushed before they reached their destinations. Assembly areas selected precisely because they were hidden in woods and orchards became killing grounds within hours of units moving into them. Senior German officers who had operated freely on the Eastern Front, who had moved their commands by day and night across Russia without the paralyzing weight of interdiction fires they were experiencing now, found themselves unable to execute the mobile defense their doctrine demanded. Rommel put the problem plainly in his formal situation report, submitted on July 15, 1944. It is preserved in the Imperial War Museum and reproduced in numerous historical collections. He wrote that the situation on the Normandy front was growing more difficult daily and approaching a severe crisis. He cited specifically, and without qualification, the enemy's enormous use of material, above all artillery, as the force responsible for German losses so high that the fighting strength of divisions was rapidly diminishing. In that same report, he documented that since the invasion his forces had suffered approximately 97,000 casualties, including 2,360 officers, against only 10,000 replacement soldiers received, of which 6,000 had actually reached the front. He concluded that the enemy would succeed in breaking through the thin German front in the foreseeable future, and that the consequences would be beyond repair. 2 days after writing those words, a Spitfire whose pilot has been variously attributed to the Royal Canadian Air Force and to pilots of the Royal Air Force strafed his staff car near the village of Sainte-Foy de Montgomery causing severe skull fractures. He was carried from the wreck and did not return to command. His assessment proved accurate to within a week. In the days before July 25, Bayerlein had moved what remained of Panzer Lehr into defensive positions south of the road connecting Perriers to Saint-Lô. 6 weeks of fighting since the division arrived in Normandy had already taken a terrible toll. Allied aircraft owned the skies by day and attacked supply columns on every road after dark. Fuel arrived in quantities insufficient to move formations any significant distance. Ammunition was rationed. Replacement vehicles and men were absorbed into the line as quickly as they arrived. The division that had crossed into the combat zone with more than 200 armoured vehicles was down to approximately 45 serviceable tanks and assault guns by the 3rd week of July. The nearly 15,000 soldiers who had entered Normandy were now roughly 5,000, with perhaps 3,200 in forward defensive positions along the front. The morning of July 25 began without incident. The German positions south of the road had been prepared over days. Slit trenches were dug to proper depth. Anti-tank guns were sighted in the hedgerows with cleared fields of fire. Communications wire ran between company and battalion command posts. The cooks at company kitchens set back from the line had begun preparing food. In the positions themselves, men checked their weapons and watched the ground in front of them as they had watched it every morning since arriving. The soldiers in those forward positions were not raw recruits. They were men who had survived years of war, who recognized the sounds of incoming fire by caliber and distance, who had learned to read terrain and build positions and economize their strength during the long weeks of defensive fighting. They had faced American attacks before and held. Staff officers at battalion and regimental command posts were completing their morning situation reports and updating their maps. Supply runners had made their nighttime runs and the daily accounting of ammunition was being tallied. Medical personnel were treating the minor wounds and ailments that accumulated in any unit holding a static defensive line through summer heat. Sentries on the forward edges of the hedgerow positions scanned the opposite line of vegetation where the American positions mirrored their own. It was, in every observable respect, a morning identical to the dozens that had preceded it. What struck some observers as unusual was the silence from the American side. There had been harassing fire in the night, but less than usual. The early morning aircraft were present, but somewhat reduced in number. At the time, it was simply quiet, and soldiers in a defensive line welcome quiet. At 0950 hours, the sound began. It came from the sky, not from the horizon where guns would announce themselves, but from directly above, a swelling mechanical roar that grew louder for minutes before the first bombs fell. The heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force were arriving in streams, hundreds of them, releasing their loads in overlapping patterns across the strip of ground where Panzer Lehr held its defensive belt. Medium bombers followed behind them. Fighter bombers came after those. The bombing lasted approximately 2 hours and 25 minutes and covered a rectangle of Norman farmland roughly 7 kilometers wide and 2 kilometers deep, the exact zone where Bayerlein's forward regiments were positioned. Approximately 4,000 tons of bombs were delivered onto that ground. But the bombers were not acting alone, and they were not the weapon that Bayerlein would remember most vividly. As the last waves of aircraft cleared the target area, more than 1,000 American artillery tubes opened fire simultaneously. Divisional and corps artillery from the 7th Corps and 8th Corps, 105mm howitzers and 155mm guns and heavier pieces at corps level, had been positioned and registered over the preceding days. Fire direction centers at battalion, division and corps level had plotted every target, computed every firing dataset, and organized every mission. At a coordinated signal, every gun fired its first round. The shells arrived without the warning of a single ranging shot. There was simply the sound of the guns behind the American lines, and then the shells were already there, simultaneously, from dozens of separate firing positions coordinated by mathematics and radio, rather than proximity or direct observation. The observers who called the fires were forward with the infantry, radio handsets connecting them through their fire direction centers to batteries they could not see and had never visited. A single call, a grid coordinate and a type of target, and the center computed the data for every tube in range, transmitted it in seconds, and confirmed the time of fire. The guns adjusted round by round as the observer walked his correction onto the target. There was no upper limit to the number of battalions a skilled observer could mass on a single grid. When the tactical situation demanded it, A Corps Fire Direction Center could coordinate the fires of every battalion under its command against a single set of targets within the time it took a German battery to complete one ranging shot. Within the first hour, the communications network of Panzer Lehr's forward positions collapsed entirely. Telephone lines severed by blast could not be repaired while the fires continued. Radio operators trying to reach their own positions received nothing, or received fragmented transmissions from men who were clearly in extremis. Runners sent forward from the command post reached the edge of the impact zone and could go no further. The command structure that linked Bayerlein to his regiments to their battalions, and battalions to their companies, ceased to function as an organized system in under an hour. What the surviving soldiers experienced in those positions, Bayerlein could only reconstruct later from the testimony of the few who came out of it. Anti-tank gun crews were buried in their positions by blast or killed by steel fragments that sliced through everything above ground level. Tank crews inside their vehicles were killed not by penetrating rounds but by the concussive shock transmitted through the hull. Soldiers in properly dug slit trenches survived the bombs overhead, only to be killed by the artillery shells that arrived immediately after, fired at lower angles and set to detonate on or near the surface. The systematic nature of the fires, covering the entire defensive belt without gaps, meant there was no safe direction to move. Moving forward put a man in front of the American infantry already advancing. Moving backward took him into reserve positions that were also under fire. Staying in place meant absorbing the continuing weight of rounds that arrived without pause and without pattern. Several men lost their minds. Bayerlein reported this without embellishment to the American historians who interviewed him. Soldiers who had held their sanity through years of combat broke in those hours. They came out of their positions and ran in the open. They were killed by splinters before they reached anywhere. When the American infantry began its assault at 1100 hours, it did not encounter a defended line. It found a landscape that Bayerlein, in the single most quoted sentence of his testimony, described as a Mondlandschaft, a moonscape, with bomb and shell craters touching rim to rim across the entire defensive belt. The infantry units that had held that ground were gone as organized formations. Isolated individuals and small groups fought on in places. Others retreated in disorder. By early afternoon, the Perrier to Saint-Lô road, the line that Panzer Lehr had been ordered to hold, had been crossed. When a courier from Field Marshal von Kluge arrived at Bayerlein's command post, demanding that the line be restored, and asking whether his grenadiers, his pioneers, his anti-tank crews were holding their positions, Bayerlein gave the answer that has been preserved in the historical record ever since. He replied that they were holding their positions, they were still and mute, because they were dead. The losses Bayerlein calculated applied specifically to the roughly 3,200 men occupying his division's forward defensive belt that morning. He estimated that more than 70% of them had been killed, wounded, driven to madness, or so severely concussed they could no longer function as soldiers. Modern historians, working from German divisional records, consider the figure somewhat overstated, but the core reality, the destruction of forward unit cohesion and command in a single morning, is confirmed by every available source. They were not ordinary soldiers. They were the men Germany had assembled from its finest institutional knowledge of armoured warfare. Panzer grenadiers who had crossed continents in the service of the Wehrmacht. Panzer crews who had qualified in the tanks everyone in the German army wanted to command. Artillery officers, signals specialists, and combat engineers who had built and cleared obstacles from Warsaw to Tripoli. The kind of men it had taken Germany years and multiple campaigns to produce, and that Germany in the summer of 1944 had no reserve of time or manpower to replace. The wider truth was that Panzer Lehr was not an isolated case. Across the Normandy front, division after division reported the same pattern. Units that arrived at full strength were depleted within days. Replacement drafts arrived at the front already exhausted from their march under Allied air attack. Equipment could be replaced, at least in theory, from the factories of the Reich. Experience could not be manufactured in any factory. A tank crew that had survived 2 years on the Eastern Front carried knowledge about terrain, mechanical management under fire, and the instincts of survival that were worth more in combat than a brand new vehicle crewed by men fresh from a training depot. Every morning the artillery took another portion of that irreplaceable knowledge with it into the ground. The broader picture confirmed the scale of attrition. By the 3rd week of July, Army Group B had sustained catastrophic losses since the invasion. Rommel's own documented assessment cited roughly 97,000 casualties in the preceding weeks, against a trickle of replacements barely sufficient to hold the line. The formations holding the Normandy front were not simply being worn down. They were being consumed at a rate that no European nation in its 5th year of total war could sustain. When a regiment lost its veteran sergeants, it did not simply lose men. It lost the tactical judgment that no manual could transmit, the kind of instinctive knowledge that came from having survived every kind of fire and terrain the war had offered. German commanders, trying to understand the defeats they were suffering, identified the same features in report after report. The speed of American artillery response defied anything in their experience. A German battery moving to a new position needed time to register its guns, time to establish communications, time to work through the chain of command before it could put rounds on a new target. An American forward observer with a radio could have the fires of multiple battalions on a target within minutes of making his call. No bracket shot announced the coming concentration. The fires could also be simultaneously massed from multiple positions across a front wider than any single battery could observe, because the coordination was done not by proximity, but by the fire direction center system that linked observers to guns through computed data rather than direct line of sight. General der Panzertruppen Heinrich Eberbach, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, acknowledged in his post-war interrogation that his own artillery had been largely unable to respond effectively during critical phases of the fighting. His guns represented an inventory of captured weapons from across occupied Europe, French, Russian, Czech, Yugoslav, and Dutch pieces assembled from years of conquest, with limited common ammunition, no shared fire direction system, and batteries that could not mass their fires above the individual unit level without hours of pre-coordination. German Army records of ammunition expenditure, analyzed by historians working with captured German logistics files after the war, indicate that 5th Panzer Army's artillery fired approximately 10% of what the opposing British artillery fired against it. Not because the guns were absent from the order of battle. Because the fuel to reposition them was not arriving, the ammunition supply was being interdicted from the air, and the command architecture to mass their fires rapidly had never been built into German doctrine the way it had been built into American doctrine at Fort Sill. 4 days after Cobra opened, on the night of July 29, a German column attempting to withdraw south through the gap in the front was caught on the road near the village of Saint-Denis-le-Gast. The 78th Armoured Field Artillery Battalion ambushed a reconnaissance column from the 2nd SS Panzer Division. The battery that made contact fired 37 direct fire rounds at the column in the opening minutes. Mortar crews added white phosphorus. Tank destroyer crews fired into the mass of vehicles. When the fight ended, approximately 600 German bodies were counted along the road near the village of Grimesnil. American losses in the engagement were 5 killed and 6 wounded. The disproportion was not a result of a qualitative advantage in weapons. It was the result of coordinated American fires arriving with no opportunity for the column to disperse before the ambush began. On August 7th, Hitler ordered what he believed would be the decisive counterstroke of the Normandy campaign. 4 panzer divisions and the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division struck the American line at Mortain. Roughly 70 tanks led the initial assault, with several hundred more committed across the operation, supported by approximately 26,000 men, with orders to cut the corridor to Avranches, trap the entire Third Army south of the breakthrough, and reverse in a single operation all that Cobra had achieved. The attack fell on the 30th Infantry Division, a formation with fewer than 6,000 riflemen holding a wide front. By any conventional calculation of combat power, the German attack should have succeeded. On Hill 314 east of Mortain, roughly 700 soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, were surrounded as German formations pushed through the gaps in the line. They remained cut off for nearly 6 days. The instrument of their survival was the artillery observer's radio. 1st Lieutenant Charles Bartz and 2nd Lieutenant Robert Weiss of the 230th Field Artillery Battalion called fire missions from their position on the hill as German armour pressed from 3 directions. Simultaneously, their battalion fired approximately 8,000 rounds during the battle. White phosphorus missions broke up infantry assaults. High explosive concentrations were walked to within close distance of the American perimeter when tank columns tried to maneuver through the fields below. The German formations that were committed to cutting through to Avranches encountered instead the condition that Bayerlein had experienced on July 25. Every road they needed, every assembly area they occupied, every axis of advance they chose, became subject to observed artillery fire within minutes of their arrival. The attack at Mortain did not fail from lack of courage or commitment. It failed because the men and machines committed to it could not survive in ground covered by American artillery directed from observers who could not be reached and silenced. The failure at Mortain accelerated what was already becoming inevitable. By mid-August, American forces from the south and British and Canadian forces from the north had compressed the remnants of two entire German armies into a narrowing pocket around the town of Falaise. American 15 Corps drove the southern jaw of the encirclement, while Allied forces closed the northern side. On August 19, the 1st Polish Armoured Division linked with American elements at Chambois, closing the pocket. The destruction assessed afterward documented approximately 10,000 Germans killed, 40,000 to 50,000 captured, and in the northern sector alone, 344 tanks and assault guns, 2,447 vehicles, and 252 artillery pieces abandoned or destroyed. General Dwight Eisenhower toured the ground and wrote that it was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. A significant share of the killing in the pocket was done by artillery, both Allied ground guns and air-directed fires from spotting aircraft that had no opposition from a Luftwaffe that had ceased to function as a fighting force over France. These were not isolated incidents. They formed a pattern that German commanders recognized and wrote about during the campaign and after it. General Feldmarschall Gunther von Kluge, who replaced Rommel in command of Army Group B after the strafing of Rommel's staff car, told General Jodl after his own frontline tour on July 12 that the situation could not be grimmer. His eventual suicide letter to Hitler, written on the night of August 18-19 from a roadside near Metz as the Falaise disaster unfolded, did not blame artillery specifically. But its despair was the direct product of a battle lost to the combined fire that Rommel had named 2 weeks before Kluge took command. The dominance of one side's fire over another was not something new to the history of war. At Gettysburg in July 1863, Union artillery on Cemetery Ridge and Little Round Top had broken the Confederate infantry assault on the third day before it reached the Federal line. At Vimy Ridge in April 1917, a carefully planned Canadian artillery program had reduced German positions that earlier attacks had found impenetrable. At El Alamein in October 1942, approximately 882 field and medium guns opened the breach through which the Eighth Army advanced. In each of those cases, the winning side had invested in the preparation, positioning, and coordination of its guns ahead of the engagement. The difference in Normandy was not mass alone. It was the combination of mass with speed, with accurate fire direction by radio, and with the ability to respond to a single observer's call with the fires of multiple battalions within minutes. Those earlier battles had used mass fires planned in advance against known positions. Normandy demonstrated that the American system could produce the same concentrated effect spontaneously against targets that had not been pre-plotted, in response to a radio call, during the fluid conditions of a moving battle. That was the specific capability that no other army had built, and its absence in the German order of battle was not an accident. It was a doctrinal choice, made in the years before the war, that could not be reversed under fire in the Norman summer of 1944. After the war ended, the German officers who survived it did not simply disperse. The United States Army, recognizing that the men it had defeated possessed knowledge about its own system that no internal analysis could capture, organized the collection of their testimony into a formal historical program. Beginning in 1945 and continuing into the late 1950s, American military historians organized the production of approximately 2,500 foreign military studies written by captured or surrendered German officers, covering every campaign the Wehrmacht had fought. The artillery chapters, drawn from the testimony of Bayerlein, von Gersdorf, Eberbach, Hauser, and dozens of others, were compiled and deposited at what is now the Combined Arms Research Library at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. They remain accessible to researchers today. Alongside the Foreign Military Studies program, the United States Army's General Board in the European theater produced a series of formal reports on the conduct of operations in Europe, covering field artillery operations, the organization and equipment of artillery units, gunnery doctrine, and ammunition supply. These documents confirmed through systematic analysis what Bayerlein's testimony described from direct experience. The Fire Direction Center system had functioned in combat precisely as it had been designed and trained to function. The ability to mass fires rapidly from multiple battalions had proven decisive across the campaign. The recommendations for future doctrine that emerged from these studies built on a foundation that the Normandy fighting had validated beyond any institutional doubt. Bayerlein himself survived the war. He surrendered with his command in the Ruhr Pocket in mid-April 1945. He spent time in Allied custody, testified extensively to the historical section, and was eventually released. He died on January 30, 1970, in Würzburg. His account, and the accounts of the officers who served alongside him, did not disappear into archives and stay there. They were studied, cross-referenced, and taught at military schools. The officers who had faced American artillery and survived the war became, in an unexpected way, among the most useful contributors to the post-war understanding of what the United States Army had accomplished. Their defeat was instructive precisely because it was thorough. They had no incentive to minimize what had beaten them. What emerged from those interrogation rooms and manuscript archives was a body of professional testimony that no Allied after-action report could have produced on its own, because it described the American system from the perspective of those who had been on the wrong side of it. The Panzer Lehr Division, or what had reconstituted itself from the survivors of July 25, fought on through the autumn and winter, participating in the Ardennes offensive of December 1944, before being reduced again in the fighting toward the Rhine. What remained surrendered in the Ruhr alongside Bayerlein in April 1945. The ground where the division was destroyed on July 25 is farmland again now. The hedgerows of the Norman bocage still divide the landscape south of Saint-Lô as they have divided it for centuries. Some of the craters Bayerlein described have been filled by 80 years of agricultural work. Others are still faintly visible in aerial photography as shallow depressions in the fields. The town of Saint-Lô, nearly entirely destroyed in the fighting of June and July 1944, was rebuilt in the post-war years and stands today as an ordinary working city in the Manche department of Normandy. There is nothing about it now that announces itself as the place where the German army in the West began its terminal collapse. The American military cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer on the bluffs above Omaha Beach holds 9,389 graves. Among them are the graves of forward observers, fire direction center officers, and artillery liaison men whose radio calls directed the fires that reduced a German division in a single morning. Their headstones do not identify them as artillerymen. They are listed as soldiers of the United States Army. Many of them were barely out of their teenage years when they died. They had trained at Fort Sill and in field exercises across a mobilizing nation, mastered the slide rule and the plotting board, and the radio procedures that the system required, and carried those skills across the Atlantic in the largest amphibious operation in the history of warfare. What the broader German testimony reveals, taken as a body, is not simply that the Americans had more guns, or more ammunition, or more determination. Rommel cited artillery above all others in his final combat report. Von Kluge confirmed the same finding after touring the front himself. Eberbach acknowledged the 10-to-1 disproportion in fire output against the British. Every senior officer who put his name to the Foreign Military Studies record returned to the same point. The thing they had encountered in Normandy was not simply greater quantity. It was a method of using guns that their own army did not possess, a method that transformed the isolated battery into an instrument of mass destruction responsive to a single observer's voice. That method had been built, as most important military innovations are built, not in response to an immediate crisis, but in the patient, unglamorous work of institutional development during years when no one was watching. The men at Fort Sill who worked through the 1930s on the Fire Direction Center were not generals. They were majors, working with pencils and radio sets and field exercises, solving a problem that most senior officers had accepted as permanent because they had always seen it that way. The solution they produced was not a new weapon. It was a new way of thinking about how existing weapons could be connected to each other through communication and computation. It was a system, not a gun. The German army that faced that system at Caen and Saint-Lô and Mortain and Falaise had built its artillery around different assumptions. It had built for planned concentrations against known targets, for the support of deliberate attacks against prepared positions. It had not built for rapid response to an observer's radio call. It had not built the communication architecture that would allow a single forward observer to become, in practical effect, the director of an entire corps artillery group. When it encountered an army that had built all of those things and practiced them until they were reflexive, it had no ready answer. The men of the German artillery were not less skilled as individual gunners. Their equipment was not inferior in range or caliber at most of the common weights, but skill and equipment at the battery level could not compensate for the absence of a system that operated above the battery level. War does not grade on individual components. It grades on how those components connect. That is the lesson the Normandy archive preserves. It is preserved in the thick folders of foreign military studies at Fort Leavenworth. It is preserved in the formal reports of the General Board. It is preserved in the pages of Rommel's last dispatch, written in the certainty of coming collapse. And it is preserved, above all, in the single word a German general used to describe what the American guns had made of the Norman fields in the summer of 1944, a moonscape. His men had built the finest defensive line they knew how to build. They had occupied it with the best soldiers Germany could put in the field, and by noon on July 25 it had become a place where only the dead remained at their posts. What Fritz Bayerlein admitted to the American historians who interviewed him was not a complaint, and it was not an excuse. It was a professional reckoning. He had commanded an elite division. He had done what his training and his orders required. The ground had been prepared. The men had been positioned. Everything that the German system could do, it had done. And it had not been enough, because the system the Americans had built was not competing on the same terms. It was operating at a level of speed, coordination, and mass that the German system could not match and had never been designed to match. The defeat at Cobra was not a failure of German courage or German tactical skill. It was the collision of a doctrine built for one kind of war with an opponent who had quietly, without announcement, built the tools for a different and more lethal kind of war altogether. The word he chose said everything about the war he had lost, and everything about the army that had beaten him.